Hi, I'm Etta Spencer. Let's go to Washington, D.C., or actually Maryland, someplace near Washington, and talk about democracy. I am just delighted to have a chance to chat with Carl Gershman, who was for many, many years, 30 some years, the director of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was endowed by, I guess, the U.S. government to try to help democratic countries uh, become more democratic a number of years ago. So, we're going to talk about the history of this organization and maybe the fate of democracy, because certainly the status of democracy in the world today is not what we expected. It's sure shocking to pick up the newspaper every day and find out what has happened. So, good morning, Carl Gershman.
How are you? Thank you. Happy to be with you, Meta.
I'm so pleased to have time to sit with you. We've been already reminiscing a little bit about when we actually, the only one time when we met in person. And it turns out we have now settled on a date. It would have been in 2004, I think you said, Carl.
Right.
And we met in the apartment of my mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset, who was the supervisor and my employer for many years. I worked for him about 5 years as his RA. And he was so good to me. He got me a fellowship once, so I didn't have to work. And he was a really wonderful man. And but he had a stroke, and he was laid up and really incapacitated seriously for about 6 years before he died. And they gave him, the National Endowment for Democracy gave him a medal. And that's when I met him, because I went down to that ceremony. But before going to the ceremony, I went to his house. And Carl and some of his colleagues arrived there at the same time. So we got acquainted a little bit, really talking about Martin Lipset in the presence of Martin Lipset, because Marty couldn't speak anymore. And we were thinking about, well, now, when did you do this? And what was that part of his biography? And we were kind of speculating, as I recall, about what had happened in his life. And he was right there, but he couldn't speak. But he was, anyway. So that's my memory of when Carl and I got slightly acquainted. Anyway, let's pick it up from there. I want to go back to the beginnings of the National Endowment for Democracy, because, there's something controversial even about the existence of an organization of that kind. Can you tell me how the history of how NED came into existence, and how you managed to pull off the politics of the thing?
Thanks, Meta. And I'm really happy to talk with you about this. Before I do, let me just start by saying a brief word about Marty Lipset. The occasion when we met and gave him our Democracy Service Medal in 2004 was at the Canadian Embassy. Mm-hmm. And we had created the Seymour Martin Lipset annual lecture on democracy in the world. So somebody would give a lecture on the state of democracy in the world. And we did that jointly with Canada, because, Marty was very proud that somebody had once called him the Tocqueville of Canada. He wrote the book Continental Divide. He was a comparativist, and he was fascinated by the contrast between the United States, which was this revolutionary society, and Canada, where people left the revolution and went north, although they were beginning to converge. But he was fascinated by the differences between the two countries. We always talked about trying to organize some kind of a U.S.-Canadian partnership. And in a way, it happened, and it happened because of this lecture. And I had a kind of a special relationship with Marty, because he was of an older generation, but we both came out of what I would call the Democratic Socialist movement. Marty was actually the chairman. I made this as a joke once when I was introducing the lecture. Marty was the national chairman of the Young People's Socialist League in 1939, and I was the chairman in 1973. And it was very small. It was very small. one of Marty's main points as a comparativist, as a political scientist, he focused on this all the time, was why didn't America develop a socialist party the way other countries did, including Canada?
Mm-mm.
What was different about America? And that was
That
really
was
what
his first book about Canada, was sort of about, I think, the NDP, and
Right.
which was taking as kind of an exception to the rule.
and he, this is what he meant by American exceptionalism. Not that we were better than anybody, but that we were different. And why were we different? How were we different? That has, become a very famous phrase since then, but it's totally misunderstood, because Marty understood that the difference of America carries with it a lot of bad things as well as good things.
Now, would you say that that is the origin of the phrase? Because people use that phrase all the time, and I'm always surprised, because they do mean that America is supposed to be proud and of itself as better than anybody else. And if he was the origin of it, I know that that's not what he meant.
No, not at all. It really started with, because Marty was a socialist, and why were we different? Why did we never develop such a party? And a lot of that had to do with, Americanism, American opportunity, that a lot of people, we also didn't have a class structure in the same way that they had in Europe. So there's many, many different reasons that led to a very high level of individualism in the United States. And but that really got Marty going as a comparativist political scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very, very deep commitment to the cause of democracy. He studied that all the time. And, I look back on the founding of NED, and I was there at the founding, as he was there at the founding. And
Really?
we started with him at the very, very beginning in many, many different ways. One of the first proposals we received was to do a study of democracy in developing countries in 1984. And it was from Marty and Larry Diamond and Juan Linz. And our board did not want to do research because they said we're a do tank, not a think tank. But this was the first research program that we funded. They were all out at Stanford. And it led to the ultimately to the creation of the Journal of Democracy and to the NEDS Research Center, the International Forum for Democratic Studies. And Marty was a founder of both of those.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a very close relationship with him from the very beginning. And I personally had a close relationship because I was, one of these social democrats, democratic socialists who, came to democracy out of the failure of social democracy or democratic socialism in the United States. An event what happened at the beginning of NED, and it's really an interesting history.
Now, let me, I don't want you to get past this, because it's very interesting that you refer to yourself and him as socialists. I certainly know he was, I don't know your history, but he certainly began as a socialist. But later in life, in fact, I think after his death, I argued with somebody who I've forgotten, somebody in an article had referred to him as one of the leaders of the conservative movement that was then sweeping Washington. Neoconservatism. And I thought, I don't think he would have called himself that, but then I got so that I think maybe he would have. So well, tell me, I don't think he would ended his life as a socialist, but I wouldn't quite know what to call him. What do you think?
I'd call him a social democrat, a moderate member of the Democratic Party, a Hubert Humphrey Democrat. I mean, as the Democratic Party turned further left after McGovern, after the 60s and after the McGovern nomination in 1972, it abandoned a lot of the older views, especially having to do with anti-communism. And Marty remained a traditional Democrat. And so he broke with the left wing of the Democratic Party and was a kind of an, as I was, a kind of a social democratic, anti-communist social democrat. Mm-hmm. Not a socialist in the sense that people think of that, because it's so misunderstood, but a social democrat committed to the welfare state, committed to all the principles of equality and economic progress for the lower classes, but also very strongly committed to individual liberty and for the democracy internationally. So he was a democratic internationalist, a social democrat. I think that fairly characterizes what he was.
Except that, if would he have ever embraced the title neoconservative?
Look, it was a word that was thrown around a lot. I was called that too. It was a word that was thrown around a lot. And during the during the Reagan period, a number of, Democrats who had broken with, in a way, the left wing of the Democratic Party is what I call it. They became neoconservatives. Some of them stayed Democrats. Some of them went over to the Republican Party. I was running a nonpartisan organization, so I was perfectly neutral. And I had been both a labor a member of the Democratic Party and, close to the AFL-CIO. But then when Reagan won the election in 1980, he appointed Jeane Kirkpatrick to be his ambassador to the United Nations, and she invited me to go with her. Mm-hmm. And I did. So in a way, I worked for the Reagan administration in the United Nations. I did so, by the way, with the full support of the president of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, and with Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had been our ambassador at the UN before. They were very happy I was going there. So I was a kind of a bipartisan, nonpartisan person, and therefore appropriate to take over an organization like the new National Endowment for Democracy, which was strictly nonpartisan and bipartisan. It was just a,
okay, but now, I'm still hung up on this word. I think Jeane Kirkpatrick would have gladly called herself a neoconservative. I'm only imagining this. I don't know.
Right, she would have.
But who else did you say?
Well, Irving Kristol.
Yeah, okay. Irving Kristol surely would have. But now the question was, would Marty have? And I don't know whether he ever used that word for himself.
No, he wouldn't have. He would not have.
Okay.
But he would have understood why some people might have labeled him that way, because on certain issues he had broken with the Democratic Party. He remained a strong anti-communist. He remained at a time of isolationism, a strong democratic internationalist. Mm-hmm. But no, he did not think of himself in that way. That's true.
Okay, good. Now let's go back to where you were leading. You're going to tell me how NED came all about.
There was a congressman by the name of Dante Fascell, who, from Florida, who was a centrist congressman, Democrat, who always felt that the United States should tell its story to the world and should support openly people who were fighting for democracy. But it was very difficult to do. And he tried a couple of times in the 60s and the 70s and failed. But when Reagan got elected in 1980, a coalition came together consisting of the labor movement, the Republicans, Democrats, and the business community. And they had the idea of creating an institution to support democracy. This came, by the way, right after the revolutions in Spain and Portugal, where the German political party foundations went into Spain and Portugal and helped the transition. And that came to the attention of the American government and Congress. What the Germans were doing was something that we should do, and we didn't have that ability. In fact, after the 60s, when there were some revelations about CIA involvement, we just really became very, very isolationist and didn't do anything internationally. But, Dante Fascell thought, let's do this openly. And the Reagan administration bought into that idea, and Reagan went to the British Parliament in June of 1982 and gave one of his great addresses, the Westminster Address, in which he called for the creation of something like the National Endowment for Democracy, a global campaign for democracy. He predicted the downfall of communism. He said that communism would end up on the ash heap of history, he said in that speech, the way other tyrannies had ended. And he also said that, and this was also quite remarkable, that there was a democratic revolution that was taking place in the world. It wasn't perceived at the time. This is 1982, right after 6 months after the crackdown in Poland, after the invasion of Afghanistan. Carter had talked about the democratic malaise in the United States. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said on the bicentennial 1976, after the fall of democracy in India, the emergency in India, when he said that democracy is where the world was, not where the world is going. But what happened in the historically...
Wait a minute, what did he mean by that?
He meant that democracy was finished. That,
well,
here you had India, the world.
Today, I'd almost say the same thing.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that's something that we can discuss. Mm-hmm. But certainly in the 1970s, it was a very gloomy period.
Right.
The fall and the American defeat in Vietnam and Cambodia, the rise of military dictatorships throughout Latin America, the failure of decolonization to produce democracy. A lot of the African countries became dictatorships. You had the rise of a kind of radical third world leftism, which was anti-American. And, the United States felt very isolated. And the world was against it and, turning against liberal democracy. And Moynihan was a kind of a pessimist. But, Samuel Huntington later wrote a book called The Third Wave of Democratization, in which he said that with the fall of the military government in Portugal on April 25th, 1974, and then the death of Franco the following year, that started a global process that he called the third wave of democratization, which was the greatest expansion of democracy in the history of the world. So we came along, as it were, at the beginning of that. Reagan gave this speech in 82. The Congress passed legislation the following year, in November of 1983. It didn't create the NED because the National Endowment for Democracy was a private organization, but it recognized the existence of this private organization and it authorized funding for it. So it would get an annual congressional appropriation, but it was a private organization. And the Congress, the people who created it, felt that it was better to have a private organization do this work rather than an organization that was attached to American foreign policy. Otherwise,
hold on. Maybe I'm anticipating you, but clearly there are two institutes that support NED, the Republicans and the Democrats, and yet they're not part of it, right? I mean, I've never been quite clear about what.
Yeah, let me explain that. When the endowment was created, the idea was to have four institutes, two of them associated with our political parties to do political work internationally, one with our labor movement, the AFL-CIO, which was already active, and the fourth with the Chamber of Commerce to support business initiatives internationally, market economy and anti-corruption and all that sort of thing. So the idea was to have four institutes. We used to call them core institutes. And the NED was the funding agency for these things. We were the grant-making organization. And so we made grants to the Democratic and Republican institutes, as well as labor and business, as well as then to other NGOs. That was the original idea of the NED. That idea was approved by the Congress and signed into law, actually, by Reagan in December of 1983. But it was very controversial. And there were a lot of people in Congress who wouldn't accept it. They saw it as potentially corrupt. The parties would be, they called it boondoggles, that they would just go on a lot of junkets, a lot of trips. They wouldn't do serious political work. Some people were concerned that it would interfere in other countries, the way the U.S. had done before, that it would somehow not be transparent. And even Congress... Clearly
that has to be the overriding question, but go on.
Well, there were a lot of questions that had to be answered. It was a new and a very controversial idea. And then you had, the late 80s was the cresting of the third wave. And you had all the revolutions in South Korea and other, Pakistan. And then you had 1989 in Eastern Europe. You had the changes in Africa. You really did have a global democratic revolution. And it got a lot of credibility with people that this could be done. But two things happened with that which were harmful to the NED. One was that people thought that because, of the revolutions and the end of the Cold War, this type of an organization was no longer needed, that everything was going to be fine. The lion would lie down with the lamb. And also they thought that now that the Cold War is over, the work was no longer very sensitive. So you didn't need a private organization to do it. The government could do it itself. And so the 90s was a very tough period for the NED. Because people said, we should get rid of this. We don't need it anymore. Charles Krauthammer once called the 90s a vacation from history. And I can remember, and I think I told you this story, but in 1995, it was a very bleak period because there was a report that our General Accounting Office was about to release. It never got released, but it was calling for our abolition to end the NED. And it would have been very difficult to survive a vote in the Congress if that report became public. And we were very active, and we had a big international conference in Washington in '95, and we had a dinner giving our Democracy Award to a number of activists. Two of them one was the widow of Andrei Sakharov, Elena Bonner, and then Sergei Kovalyov, who just died, but was the great human rights leader in Russia. And one was a Mexican activist who led what really was a transition in Mexico in 1994. And then a fourth person was a woman who was a human rights activist from Rwanda, which had experienced a genocide in '95. So it was a very moving affair. And Marty, I remember, was very moved by it. In fact, Sidney, his widow, told me that Marty was in tears during the dinner. He was so moved. And he wanted to do something to help because we were in trouble. So I said, Marty, write an article. And he did. And I still have that article, and I refer to it all the time. And what he was trying to tell the Congress in that article was that the struggle for democracy did not begin with the Cold War. It began before the Cold War. And he talked about in the 19th century, the way people like the Hungarian liberal leader Louis Kossuth or Mazzini from Italy would come to America and see America as the future of liberal democracy. And America stood for something during that time. With all of our problems, we stood for this hope in the world. Then you had the Cold War, and this struggle became a kind of a bipolar struggle between, the United States democracy and then communism, which was a kind of a fraudulent idea of equality. And then with the end of the Cold War, which was dominated everyone's thinking, people thought, well, the struggle was over. And he said, no, the struggle is not over. It goes on everywhere the way it went on before. And in every country in the world, he said, there is a party for freedom and democracy, and there's a party against freedom and democracy. That's the way politics is organized globally. And he said,
and today we have the same thing,
Right.
We have Liz Cheney in the same, if you'll call it a party, as Bernie Sanders. I mean, both are for democracy. And that's the biggest cleavage we've got right now. It's not between left and right. It's between people who want democracy and people who oppose it.
Well, Marty said this is happening all over the world. A lot of it has to do with pro-American and anti-American attitudes. But this was '95, and it was long before the current troubles. This was still a time when people were complacent about democracy. That was the problem, complacency, not fear of democracy moving backwards. But then you had a number of things happen. You had 9/11, the global financial crisis 7 years later in 2008. And then you had the end of the third wave and the beginning of what I would call a reverse wave, the beginning of one. Freedom House does an annual survey of freedom in the world, and it said that for the last 16 years, going back to 2005, democracy has been in decline, in retreat. Freedom has been in decline and retreat. So this is a process that really began around then and has gotten worse since then, with the rise of China as a non-democratic, anti-democratic country, with the growing aggressiveness of Putin and Russia, Iran, and also the crisis of liberal democracy and populism, the fact that you could have the crisis we've had in the United States that you're referring to. And so we've had this very, very serious problem, and it's gotten worse and worse. The last annual survey of Freedom House was the worst, the last couple of years with the sharpest decline in democracy ever. But that doesn't mean that the ball game is over, any more than it was over in the 1970s. And there are a lot of things happening today that I just think we have to pay attention to. I mean, first of all, the election that took place in this country, the by-election just on Tuesday, was I think, frankly, a very, very positive development. There was a rejection of extremism by both sides. It was a defeat for Trump. Everybody is looking at it as a sharp defeat for Donald Trump and for the possibility that he could return as president of the United States.
Oh, really? I would not have thought of it as that decisive. You think it was?
Oh, that's the view of today is now. I don't know when people are going to be watching this interview, but today is Thursday, November 10th, and it's 2 days after the election. And that is the general consensus of the media. And in a way, it's a positive and stabilizing force, because if the United States really goes into a deeper crisis, democracy is endangered throughout the world. But this is not the only thing that's happened. You had an election in Brazil, which is the largest country in Latin America, just a couple of weeks ago. And the fact that Bolsonaro accepted the result of this election, he, like Trump, said that he considered it was going to be fraudulent, but he lost and he accepted the result. And that's a tremendous step forward.
It's going to have, you can, for every case that's favorable, you can think of something like Netanyahu getting back into power.
But that's democracy too. You may not like Netanyahu. He may be a conservative. You may disagree with his policies, but Israel is a very, very democratic country. And the Economist Intelligence Unit, which publishes an annual survey of democracy in the world, Israel is rated one of the most democratic countries in the world. And you had, an Arab Islamist party participating in the previous government. You have 14 Arab Israeli members of the Israeli parliament. This is democracy. And the Palestinians in Israel know it's democracy. I mean, they looked upon themselves as the most democratic in the whole Arab world because they live in Israel. Mm-hmm. I've had many Palestinian friends tell me that. Okay. So Israel is a democracy, even though obviously, you can argue about a two-state solution and peace and all that, but it's a democracy. And my point is that there are positive developments taking place. Democracy is not about to go under. And I would add to that something which I think is very important, that the dictatorships, the authoritarian countries are in crisis. What's happening on the streets of Iran today is a profound challenge to the Islamist dictatorship. Putin's utter catastrophic failure in Ukraine threatens his own regime. Now, we don't know what's going to come after Putin, because I think he will fall, because this war is lost for Russia and the government will eventually fall. We don't know what's going to come after, but you for the first time, in my view, you have the possibility that there could be something better, because as long as Russia saw itself as a powerful imperialist country that could control its neighbors, there was no chance for an alternative kind of Russia. But once it's defeated, and in a traumatic defeat, it's possible that something different could emerge. So I don't give up even on Russia, even though I know a lot of people do. And then you have China, which is, Xi Jinping is asserting his power after this 20th Party Congress. But, it's going through an economic crisis. It's going through, the way they've handled COVID has been an absolute disaster. It's not out of the question that China could change for the better. It has a much more educated population. We had Min Jinpei, the China specialist, give the Lipset lecture 2 years ago. And he gave the Lipset lecture about Xi Jinping in China. And, he said, here you had Marty Lipset saying that if you develop a middle class, you'll get democracy. China has developed a bigger middle class, but it doesn't have democracy. Was Lipset wrong? Or will Lipset be right in the long term? Mm-hmm. And his conclusion at the end of the article was that Lipset will be proven right in the long term. Mm-hmm. And that had to do with the fact that a fifth of the Chinese population will have college degrees, but also that China's international aggressiveness will create a backlash and will force, China to increase its arms expenditures. It's not as wealthy as it thinks it is. The Belt and Road program has proven to be quite a disaster for China. And he believed that, we don't know when, but he believed that within the next 15 or 20 years, China could evolve. You had in 1989, you had Tiananmen Square and you had uprisings in cities across China. It's not inconceivable. You don't expect these things because Tiananmen Square came just 13 years after the death of Mao Zedong, who was the worst dictator in Chinese history. And there are a lot of people who feel that as Xi Jinping tightens the dictatorship, he's going to accelerate the process of the unraveling of dictatorship in China. So we don't know. All I'm saying is there are possibilities for change in the future that are democratic, and even conceivably a fourth wave of democratization, because the consciousness of people all over the world has been raised by the internet, by communications, and they have aspirations for democracy, much more so than they ever had before. Whether democracy can evolve is a very big challenge, but there are now people around the world that have aspirations for more human rights, more dignity, more rights. And I believe that that's a pressure that's not going to go away.
Well, you are warming my heart, but
Well, I don't want to give you unrealistic hopes. I'm sometimes accused of being.
I'm not going to buy half of what you said.
Right. Okay,
don't worry.
You'll worry
because my objection is even more fundamental, or at least the basis for my pessimism is more fundamental. Because back a minute ago we were saying, well, Israel is is really a democracy, and never mind that they brought in Netanyahu again. No, that's the problem. Even countries that are truly democracies, and I still regard the U.S. as basically a democracy, half of the decisions they made, or the majority of the decisions they made, are fatal. I mean, they make such bad decisions, they reach such bad policies that we can't live with democracy anymore. That's the terrible thing. The democracy as it functions today, whether you're talking about countries that are not democratic or the ones that are, it's not working right. And it may be completely unacceptable or untenable, or it may be just fatally broken. And that's what worries me. I mean, the very fact that you can have somebody like Trump, even the prospect of maybe becoming president again, or how in the hell did he ever get to be president in the first place? That's a terrible indictment on democracy itself. If the majority of the people really wanted somebody like that, and the majority of the people in Russia now absolutely are still behind Putin. They will, and they haven't given up hope to be the great Slavic empire. He wants to be Peter the Great. Well, they would love to have a Peter the Great. That's what bothers me. I don't think democracy works anymore. And that's the worst thing, most bitter conclusion I've reached in maybe my political life, to have, because democracy has been sort of like my religion. And I think now we need so many changes in it to make it fulfill the basic purposes that democracy are supposed to fulfill. And I don't see how we're going to get there. So I'm much more pessimistic than you are.
Well, look, you're in a way making your own argument for democracy, because democracy its greatest strength is its ability to self-correct, that it goes through crises, deep crises. And even though these crises can threaten the very existence of democracy, it has the capacity to course adjust, to self-correct. And that's the great challenge before the United States today with our electoral system. And people, there are a lot of people looking at this problem very carefully, but I believe that we took a step in the right direction on Tuesday. And that's all you can hope for, a step in the right direction. democracy is not a utopia. Democracy doesn't eliminate problems. Democracy doesn't eliminate divisions. You've had a lot of people in the United States who feel like they're not getting a fair shake. The liberal Democrats have lost the working class. Why have they lost the working class? Or they're losing the working class. Not just the white working class. It's not just a racial issue.
Mhm.
It's the Hispanic working class.
Mhm.
How do you reach out to people at a time of globalization and growing inequality, economic inequality, and where people feel like they're not getting a fair shake? And democracy has to adjust and address the concerns of such
It's not
people.
just inequality. That's the biggie, or it's not even the biggest biggie. The biggest biggie is climate change, because we simply do not have enough time to make the kinds of adjustments that need to be made in terms of, I don't know whether you're talking about the Electoral College or gerrymandering or all these other flaws that need to be fixed in order to perfect American democracy. We don't have the time to do that because, the ice is melting. Sorry, but the ice melts at a predictable rate, and it's going to be all gone before we have anywhere near the kinds of political changes.
Well, there could be a catastrophic existential crisis like that. They could ultimately eliminate human civilization. I'm not saying that that's impossible. I'm only saying that, the only way to try to correct that problem is through people taking actions that, will restrain, and which we're beginning to do, restrain the, carbon pollution in the world. And, I don't see how you can do that without democracy. It's just, countries like China are, they don't really give a damn about the climate problem. They only care about their own economic growth. At least in the US, you have this massive, and in Europe, you have massive public pressure for change in policy. And you just have to hope that will, that will grow, that democracy can find and science and technology can find the means to have alternative sources of energy, which won't create the same problems for the atmosphere, for ecology, for the climate. That's, you just have to hope that. And we've had this enormous technological progress, and I believe that's possible. I believe it's possible to find ways to empower the world safely, although nothing is ever airtight safe, without, contributing to the pollution that we've done. This is what's the great challenge before us as a civilization. But that doesn't mean that democracy has therefore failed. Democracy, again, is not a solution to all problems. It just gives you the capacity to try to work on these problems in a democratic way. And one of the things we see today, you look at Russia and the decision to take this horrible decision to take, engage in this aggression, or even China, with the way it has had these lockdowns over COVID and other problems, that dictatorships don't do very well in addressing these problems. They don't have the self-correcting mechanism. The dictator wants to go forward, and it's mostly a he, not entirely a he, but the way the strong man wants to conduct business without any accountability. And when you have no accountability, no system of checks and balances, you much more likely to make disastrous, terrible mistakes. And democracy offers an alternative to that. It's not perfect. And you do have the possibility with democracy that you can have, and often it's a plurality, but a kind of autocratic plurality will elect a dictator. It happened in Germany in 1933. And it can happen, it happens can happen in a number of countries. And it could have, I think it's less likely to happen here in 2024. I say that with more confidence today than I would have said it a week ago. And I think that's terribly important. But it's, but people, you have to build trust in the population. Democracy is a process where you have to build trust, accountability, you have to have participation, you have to have citizenship. And these things are really, really tough. I mean, if I've learned anything about democracy since the beginning, the Ned when I started with this. I was too optimistic in the beginning. I thought that, and it's true that we all were optimistic in 1989. It was a very hopeful period.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we started seeing the problems, and then the problems got worse. And then as the problems developed, not just the backsliding of democracy in countries like Turkey and Venezuela, Thailand, and other countries like that, it was just not backsliding any kind of new and weak democracies, but the established democracies, the United States and even the European countries, but especially the United States, developed this problem of illiberal populism, which was extremely dangerous. And I think a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
for the first time, colleagues of mine at the National Endowment for Democracy grew very pessimistic. My hunch is, I haven't really had a discussion with them now, my hunch is that some of the events that I've referred to before, whether it's in a country like Brazil, the setbacks to Putin in Russia, the revolution in Iran, and now, the possible small turn in the United States, these are encouraging. So I think, it's not a time for, by any means, it's not a time for despair. And the only way you can improve anything is if you don't give up hope. I mean, you never can give up hope. That was the message of Václav Havel. It's that hope is really a kind of dimension of the soul, and you don't, if despair is sort of goes against the democratic grain.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I live off hope. I live off duty. If I find that the thing I'm supposed to do is not going to work, I'll go ahead. If I think I'm supposed to do it, I think I'll go ahead and try it anyway, even if I know I'm probably not going to succeed. But that's not my real issue. My concern about my worst concern about the status of democracy in the world is that it's still localized in nation states. So we have, you can be cheerful about maybe some slight great glimmer of hope in the U.S. election, or the fact that Lula was elected by a little bit and so on. You can look for the silver lining or the glimmer of rosiness. But my problem is that the worst of the world problems are things that need cooperation globally. And we have no institutions that are global that are in any sense democratic. I mean, the UN is not a democracy. It's an organization of states, and the interests of states are very frequently in complete violation of the interests of their own people. So unless we have some sort of democracy in which the interests of people are represented, and the people make the laws, and that we have international laws that have to be enforced and that can be enforced, I think that a global change toward democracy is absolutely essential. And I have no idea how you're going to get there.
Well, you can.
Right now, I don't know how in the world you would call a meeting of people and say, let's revise the Charter of the United Nations in such and such a way as to actually make sure that Putin, if he starts doing something that's contrary to international law, there'll be a way to send somebody to get him and put him on trial before he can even invade. I mean, if he masses his troops around the border of Ukraine and he's going to invade, we got to stop him before he can even get going. There's no way of doing anything like that now. And that is the essential thing. We have to have that, and we have to have people who, Bolsonaro did quite win in Brazil, but the rainforest, I don't know that it's safe. It's sure going down real fast. And we need to have some way of saying, this country, sorry guys, but you can't cut down your rainforest because the whole world needs that rainforest, and so on. We need ways of meeting global challenges with global institutions. And I want them to be democratic, but I just want them to exist, first of all.
Well, look, I mean, we created the United Nations after World War II with great hope.
Yeah.
But the world was what it was, and it's not going to change. And there's no, if you think about it, there's really no way to implement what you want. And I would be terrified of a global government. I mean, who runs it, and how would it be democratic, and how would you have citizenship in such a large polity? I mean, the great thing about the nation state, and I think we should be positive about the nation state, is that it makes citizenship possible. You can't have citizenship without citizens, and citizens have to be part of a country, and that country has to have the rule of law.
I don't agree with that, but okay, that's a whole different show. But I'm at least going to register my disagreement with you, because I think you could have, right now, everybody with a cell phone in the world could sign up and say, I want to be a citizen of the world. And here's my $1 a year taxes. And you can put me down as somebody who's eligible to vote. And we will have a meeting of a citizens assembly where we'll draw lots and draw straws and so on, and see who's going to be our lawmaker. And I've got a plan. It can be done.
Well, I think trying to make the nation state work and be democratic is much more feasible than some kind of global governance through the internet. I mean, you can always have, and the internet is certainly being used to have greater accountability within nation states, to have citizens be able to express themselves much more. And it's a very, very difficult process because, as we know, there are a lot of bad effects that can come from social media. I mean, social media does not encourage really civility and democracy. We ran a lot of articles on this in the Journal of Democracy. It encourages divisiveness. It encourages atomization. It encourages, it doesn't encourage democratic processes. Now, democracy is difficult, and it takes time. But I just don't see the alternative. I mean, democracy ultimately has to come down to the grassroots, and you don't get that if you don't get.
I want democracy. I just think it has to be revised and made more democratic. That's the problem.
Well, that's possible. I mean, it's becoming more democratic. I mean, just think about the enormous changes that have taken place in democracy, not just since the founding of the United States, when we were created. Think about how. When did you get the women's vote? Was it 1922? We had a civil war over slavery, and then after slavery, we had Jim Crow, and we had a civil rights movement, and we have continuing problems. So it's a constant struggle. Think about a country like Ukraine, how difficult it is to transition from their history, their culture, and the Soviet Union to a democracy. And so they had a revolution for independence in 1991. They voted for it. But then they had a kind of a old line communist leader. And then they had an orange revolution in 2004. They had, they had a revolution in a certain sense in 2000 when hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets because they had murdered a journalist, Georgi Gangadze, who had been exposing corruption by the government. They murdered him, and that led to a revolution. And then you had the Orange Revolution, which was a revolution against the old guard. That terrified Russia, and so Russia determined that that's really when the start of the Russian desire to repress Ukraine started. And then you had another revolution in 2013. Why did it was another revolution where the people in Ukraine took to the streets to say we want to be part of Europe, and ultimately they overthrew the Yanukovych government, and he fled, and then Putin annexed Crimea, and that was when the formal current war actually began, and invaded eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and it was all a struggle between people who said we want freedom and the Russians who said no, you're not going to have freedom. And there's a long, long history to that. And these struggles take place locally all around the world. I mean, you can find people always fighting against local powers that are stronger. And so, the only way you can work this out, you can say, well, why did the UN fail? from your point of view, obviously it did fail. The United States wanted to bring the Soviet Union into the UN, but to do so, it had to give the Soviet Union a veto. It had to give,
Would the U.S. itself have, if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union, do you think the U.S. would have accepted something that was truly more democratic without a veto? I mean, I assumed that all of the P5 countries had wanted or demanded veto power.
Well, you had to have look, if you're going to have international law, you have to have some ability to enforce it. You just don't have that because, you just can't have well-intentioned people governing the world. It doesn't work that way. You had to deal with the forces and the powers that you had. And, at the time, the compromise was to have the P5. But look at that now. Why should France and the UK, the United Kingdom, why should they have the status of a global power? And maybe the European Union, but the world has changed. Why doesn't India have a permanent veto? And so obviously the system has to be reformed.
I do away with the vetoes altogether, but I think in a way we need to go back to the first part of the issue about NED's mandate, because you mentioned the struggle about in Ukraine, and when they wanted to break away from Russia and Russia's power and become more a part of the EU and so on, which I would certainly hope that they would rather prefer that direction. But still, they accuse the U.S. of having masterminded the Orange Revolution and the subsequent, even more the subsequent one. And clearly they don't use the word NED, but I think they're referring to the notion that you gave them money to run this protest movement. And that this is a violation of what is considered a standard of Westphalian democracy, which is that one country does not legitimately interfere with the political doings of another country. So the U.S. should not have had anything to say about the outcome of the Orange Revolution. So I think that is where we need to put a little focus. I mean, I've never seen any theoretical justification for how NED explains itself or justifies its interference, if you will, in the political affairs of other countries. But I certainly hope it does. I think that the NED should, in fact, do everything possible. And I would like to speak up on behalf of the notion that if there's a R2P, the right to protect, there also should be something like a right to assist democratic forces within other countries that need help to get power. I'm all for it, but I haven't heard any theoretical justification for the role of NED in interfering in the politics of other countries. So put yourself on trial, sir.
Yeah, look, I mean, of course, we had to do that during the struggle for Ned's existence. Yeah. And when you say interference in the politics of other countries, that's a loaded phrase, the way you put it. If you support free media, is that interference in the politics of another country? If you support independent civil society or women's organizations or think tanks, is that interference in the politics? I mean, the NED has rules about not interfering in the politics of other countries. We have election support guidelines.
I know a guy who was maybe not the leader of, but certainly one of, if not the leader of the Orange Revolution. And I think he said somebody from the U.S., and I don't know whether it's NED or some other deep-pocketed organization, but it was a government outfit, gave him $2 million to run this tent city. I don't think anybody could quibble with whether or not there's a political movement. It seems to me it was very political and very, very justifiable.
But what was it for?
You did it.
It was, what the Orange Revolution was a movement of citizens against the stealing of an election. That's what it was. It was against the stealing of an election that was internationally observed, and it was observed by the Ukrainian people. And eventually, Yanukovych, who had stolen the election, that they were defeated. And you had in the end a fair vote. All that the Ned would support in that context would be the observance of elections, the support of domestic observers of elections. We have rules against supporting political parties one against another in elections. We don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been the feeling in the beginning of Ned by some people that the Ned should go around, or the U.S. should go around, interfering in elections by supporting one party against another. But we're a transparent organization, and we have rules against that. We even have rules.
But surely there are other ways of being political besides supporting political parties.
But that's the main thing. And the question is, if you want to support democracy, how do you do it other than by trying to nurture and support indigenous democratic activities and organizations, whether it's women's organizations or youth organizations or independent media? That's what the Ned does. Iran can say that's encouraging a color revolution. Russia can say that's encouraging a color revolution. But all it is in trying to empower citizens to realize their own destiny. And
well, God bless you. I agree with you. I want you to do it. I just want you to justify it better, because I think you're on the defensive. When people talk about you shouldn't interfere in the affairs of another country, and that's the whole notion of sovereignty. Don't mess around with our affairs.
But how far do you carry that? How far do you carry that?
I don't. I don't believe in sovereignty.
Well, but I do believe in sovereignty. Law. I do believe in sovereignty.
Yeah.
But I believe that, everything is not black and white. In 1970, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he very famously said in that Nobel Prize, he was talking about how do we have a single world? Because communications were uniting us much more. How do we have a single world? And he was saying that, there are no, in this world that we lived in, and he was talking about human rights at the time, he said famously, there are no internal affairs left on our crowded earth. And it's appropriate to be concerned about human rights in another country, because what the Soviet Union is saying was that even to speak out for human rights was interference in the internal affairs of another country. And that's what China says today. Anybody who speaks out for human rights. So you have to have a proper balance between, I guess my point to you is that balance does exist, that the Ned is run as a transparent organization funded by the Congress, where everything is open and you can see what the programs are, and that whether or not they violate, international law. We adopted a statement of principles and objectives at the very beginning that said that everything that we do is subject to international law and is legal under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the ILO conventions, that everything that we do, whether it's worker rights or individual rights, is subject to international law. And if the organization violated that, it would be known, and it would be a scandal, and obviously the Congress would defund it. But it stays within that framework. Of course, you're going to get a country like Russia saying that all of our problems come from a foreign interference. I mean, they said that it was all the U.S. inviting Ukraine to join NATO that was the source of the trouble and the uprising. But if you go back to the Euromaidan revolution in 2013 and 2014, there was a majority opinion in Ukraine against joining NATO. What turned opinion around in Ukraine? It was obviously the threat of Russian aggression. What turned it around in Sweden and in Finland? I mean, in other words, Putin has been his own worst enemy. And through his aggressiveness and through his threats, he has sort of given NATO, through his invasion of Ukraine, he has revived NATO. Why? Because people felt that they needed this kind of defense against Russian aggression. And I think, it's possible ultimately to get beyond these types of blocks and these types of defensive alliances. But that is only going to come through democracy. And by having a government in Russia, for example, that while it certainly is entitled to a kind of national sentiment, when it's not saying you can't be nationalist, but you can't be aggressively and imperialistically and hegemonically nationalist. You got to allow, countries to have their independence. And I would say that's the same with China and Taiwan. Taiwan has become not a recognized international country, but it is a democracy. It's a magnificent democracy. And Russia and China are saying, we won't accept it. We won't accept it. We want you to be part of our country in the same way that we've absorbed Hong Kong. And that's a great threat that the world faces. How do you oppose that? How do you mobilize opposition to China invading or aggressing against the democracy of Taiwan in the same way that Russia did against Ukraine? These are great challenges. These are great challenges that we face, and I don't think there's any alternative but trying to do it through democracy and by.
I'm not against democracy. I just want democracy to become more democratic.
Well, yes, and I think there's only one way for democracy to become more democratic, and that's through people fighting for more democracy. I mean, what's the alternative? Nobody's going to give it to them. You never get anything for free. You got to fight for it. And the only way you can fight for it is if you have democratic rights.
So here we are fighting each other.
Well, we're disagreeing in a subtle sort of way, but in the end,
a little bit, not too much though, because basically, I think that really what we do very much agree on is the importance of democracy, whatever form we want it to be in. So,
and look, from my point of view, from where I come from here in the United States, that we're going back to the beginning with, running this tiny little organization called the Young People's Socialist League that Marty Lipset once ran. The idea that we have now in the United States is not all that powerful, but the idea that you have a publicly funded institution, which involves both of our political parties and our business community and our labor movement, to actually advance democracy internationally in a transparent way with the support of the U.S. Congress in a divided country, but the support of both parties in the U.S. Congress, to me, that's a miracle. And to do it the right way, in other words, not the wrong way, which is we're going to domineer, we're going to tell countries what to do, they're going to conform to U.S. policy. No. To try to empower the citizens in those countries to realize their own vision of democracy, difficult as that is, I think that's a miracle. So, but we can.
It's been a miracle that you have done. What is it? 34 years.
I was there. I was actually the founding president and was there for 37 years to get it
37.
Accepted.
Well, bless your heart. It's wonderful.
To get it accepted. And, and I think Marty would have understood that that's a miracle because little things like that don't happen automatically, We almost were knocked out of existence many times and we survived.
Thank you so much, Carl. This has been not only stimulating, but fun. So I appreciate all of the wonderful work that you've done and keep it up. And I hope the NED does the same for many years to come.
Thank you very much.
All right. I've enjoyed this very much. So
okay, great.
Take care.
I did too.
Bye.
I did too.
Project Save the World produces these shows, and this is episode 521. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there too about 6 global issues. If you want to find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.